Hello, everybody. Thank you for being patient with me, sticking through this. I know it's one of our longer lectures, but it's got a lot of important information in it that you need to know. So as we were talking about, agriculture is one of these activities that has the greatest impact on our environment that's really possible. And that's something that we can't really avoid. As we have more and more people, we have to produce more and more food in order to sustain that population. So we've got a bunch of challenges that come up as a result of this. When we start to domesticate animals and try to produce more livestock, we tend to see more disease for some of the reasons we talked about in our last portion, including overcrowding. But in addition to that, you also start to see some genetic diseases pop up because you're reducing the genetic variety in the breed. You're tending to try to just push for more milk or more meat. And as you do that, the species becomes a little bit more and more inbred as time goes on. And when you lose that genetic diversity, that takes away some of your protection from these widespread disease outbreaks. When things are more genetically similar, that means that they're going to be equally susceptible to the disease. Now, that also means that if we're losing some of those heritage breeds, some of those ancient varieties, then we are also losing that genetic diversity forever in some cases. That takes away from all the opportunities we could have in the future to genetically engineer species or to selectively breed them together and recover some of that genetic diversity. So it really does limit us in the future, and you have some farms that dedicate themselves specifically to trying to preserve some of those heritage breeds so that that doesn't happen. So one of the other problems that comes up with feeding so many people is that people tend to depend on just a few types of food, and these are known as staple foods. So altogether, just 3 crops, wheat, rice, and corn, provide more than half of the world's consumed calories. And you can say that beyond that, there's not really that many other staple foods that make up the rest. Fish and shellfish are an important source of food for about 1 billion people, mostly in Asia and in coastal areas of a lot of developing countries. They make up about 20% of the total protein source for the world. But you can see that most of our crops are very similar to each other in terms of nutritional content. They mostly kind of are grown in areas where they originated, although they've spread quite a bit since then. So crops like corn, even though they may have originated in Mexico, are now huge staple crops across the world. But the countries in certain areas where these crops originated do tend to rely on that crop more. So much of Asia is going to rely on rice and soy. And that really tells you a little bit about our food's history. When we are so reliant, that means that all of our calories are coming from these particular staple foods. And that's a little scary if you start thinking about what could happen to any of these staple foods. So altogether, we grow nearly 2,100 million metric tons of just those 3 grains, wheat, rice, and corn, every year. And wheat and rice are especially important because they're staple foods for almost all of the 5 billion people in the developing countries. Those 2 grass species alone supply around 60% of the calories consumed directly by humans as a whole species. So if something were to happen to that wheat crop, or something were to happen to that rice crop, much like what happened with the potato famine in Ireland, that would be a huge, huge problem, huge food shortage. So here are some of the different dominant staple crops of the world, and again you can see they're very much by region. The mountainous regions in the high latitudes like northern Europe and northern Asia have cool, moist climates, so those types of biomes are going to be more suitable for things like potatoes, oats, barley, and rye. Where the warm, wet areas, like much of Amazonia in South America, Africa, Melanesia, the Southern Pacific, they are going to be more reliant on things like plantains, cassava, sweet potatoes, and other tubers that are going to do well in that warm, wet soil. And then your dry regions like Africa are going to rely on grasses that can survive in that arid region, like sorghum or millet. So one of the most important, as we mentioned, is rice. And rice supports some of our largest populations in the world, in that Southeast Asia sort of region. And 90% of all the world's rice is grown in that region, but rice is actually a staple for nearly half of all the people in the world. So you can see that by far it outpaces all of the other staple crops. And one of the problems with this is that rice does not have a very big yield per acre. So it takes a lot of water to grow the rice. You need all this irrigation in place. We talked about soil salinization, some of the things that can come about as an effect of all that irrigation. And then in addition to that, even though we cultivate so many varieties of rice, a lot of the rice that we grow is just a few different varieties, and they're not very genetically diverse. And it turns out that they are very susceptible to heat stress and to changes in salinity and changes in water levels. And all these things come about as a result of climate change. And then that really poses a threat to, again, half the people in the world who are relying on rice as their main food. So when we start talking about producing enough food, a lot of times we're just talking about producing enough grain to support these people. And if we look at grain alone, you can see that our total grain production keeps going up and up and up because of advances in agriculture. And a lot of people will argue we'll always have enough food to feed everyone because we'll keep improving our agriculture to produce more. But the problem is when you start looking at per capita grain production, which is per person, how much grain you are producing. Since our human population is going up so dramatically, our grain production is just not quite keeping up, and it is starting to slowly slow down and decrease. In addition to grains, you need to think about protein too. So either you're talking about livestock usually, or fish and shellfish, although there are vegan proteins like soybeans. With fish and shellfish, we have dramatically overfished our oceans. Remember that O part of HIPCO, over harvesting. That's the big problem here. And so our wild catches have outpaced the rate that those ecosystems can replenish themselves at. So we have to find a solution to that. We have to let these ecosystems replenish their fish populations, but then we also need to feed enough people. So we may have to look at things like aquaculture, which you're going to explore a little bit later. When we also try to maintain food levels in the world so that we have enough for everybody, one of the things that comes into play is grain stockpiles, or what are called carryover stocks. And these are basically the amount of food that you would need to feed people in your country for a certain amount of time. So you can see that this is about the amount of food that the world in general has on hand, and how long it would last in terms of days if we were to stop making food right now. And you can see that it hovers right around about 70, 80 days that we could continue to feed people if we were to stop producing food right now. Something happened like a volcanic eruption that wiped out all the sunlight and you couldn't make any more. We could feed people for around 80 days. And that goes up and down a little bit. But the UN does estimate that we shouldn't ever let that fall below 70 days because we would be in danger of having major shortfalls if we had some small climatic event. Now, we have seen the carryover stocks worldwide start to go down, and part of the reason for that is our meat consumption. The more meat we eat, the more grain we have to use to raise that meat. And that's grain that we could be eating personally. So you can see that our meat consumption varies in a huge amount throughout the world. But again, the US has one of the highest per capita consumption rates of meat. And every time you go up the food pyramid, remember that you lose 90% of the energy. Only 10% of that energy gets passed on. So if you're eating grain, you're getting a much more direct source of energy. That energy was captured from sunlight by photosynthesis, put into that grain, and then it's only going one more step to get to you. If you are feeding a cow, on the other hand, that's going to take a whole lifetime of the cow eating so much grain every single day just for you to get that one steak. So the number of people that the world can support really depends on our per capita consumption of grain versus meat. The more grain we eat, the more people we can support. The more meat, the less people we can support. It also depends on how many children you're going to have, because the more children you have, generally the less your income, your overall expendable income, which means you're more likely to be in poverty with more children. And that means that you are more likely to live low on the food chain, where you're not eating a lot of meat. So there are kind of checks and balances in here. But in general, meat consumption is seen as a luxury kind of item, so a lot of people tend to want to eat meat. When you look at the kilograms of grain that we need to produce a kilogram of meat, it varies a lot depending on the size of the animal. So you can see that beef is one of the most grain-intensive foods you can possibly have. It's going to take a ton of soy or corn to produce that beef cow that's on your plate. Pigs and chicken, also pretty intensive. Fish is one of the more efficient ways to convert grain into protein, but again, none of them are as efficient as just eating grain themselves. So when we start looking at solutions, one of the things that we always start talking about is eating a more plant-based diet, so that we're not using all of that food just to produce different types of food. Also, the more food you can grow your own, especially in an urban area with urban gardens, or the more you can hunt in a sustainable way, the better, since you're providing for yourself and we don't have to look as much outside of the family. We waste a tremendous amount of food. Up to 90% of the world's food products are wasted and thrown out because they expire early. So wasting less, finding ways to do that. Buying food that's produced locally, that supports your local economy. You usually know what kind of farming practices went into that. It's a lot easier to see that. They have to be more transparent. And in addition, a lot of times those small farms will use more environmentally sound methods and won't have as large of an impact. And choosing organic food is also important when that's possible, although obviously that can be cost prohibitive. We'll talk more about that when we talk about pesticides. So there's some different things that governments can do to influence the amount of food that we make. And one is that they can control prices. So they do this with a lot of things like milk and corn, where they will set a particular price to try to keep the price low enough that consumers can afford it, while high enough that the farmers can get some money back to pay for their investment. And another thing that kind of complicates that situation is a lot of times we provide farmers with subsidies. So basically, if we don't need all of the corn that they made that year, we will still pay them for all that corn. And then that way the farmer doesn't go out of business. This is good for the farmer. And really, part of our economy does depend on this, because if that farmer were to go out of business, then that could cause a chain reaction down the line. However, by subsidizing something that is then not being sold, the government never makes back that money on that. So we're basically operating at a loss on purpose to try to keep these farmers in business. And the third option that the government has is they can let the marketplace decide. So they can let it operate purely on supply and demand. And at least in this kind of situation, they would not themselves be losing money. However, you could have a bad year. You could have a drought. You could have something happen that really affects your supply or your demand of that product. And then that's going to impact your economy quite a bit more if you base it purely on supply and demand. So they have to make some tough decisions here. So we mentioned that fisheries, or fish and shellfish, make up almost 20% of the protein source for the entire world, and especially for people who are living on coastal areas. And the developing world is a huge portion of that. So one of our biggest problems here, again, is overharvesting. We're harvesting our fish stocks way faster than they can replenish themselves, and we're not protecting what's there. And we're eating a lot of fish and shellfish that are not sustainable. So there are lots of different ways you can find out whether what you're eating is sustainable or not. One way is to go online to the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and they have a whole sustainability scale, and they'll tell you how environmentally friendly it is to eat certain fish and which ones you should avoid. But when we start to look at this, we want to really invest in these sustainable fisheries because we want to keep these proteins around for years to come. They're a great source of nutrition. And we want to have that positive influence on our economies moving forward too. So we start looking at how can we limit our catch in terms of fish so that we can let those populations recover. But then we also start looking at using different types of fishing methods, or maybe even aquaculture, where we farm fish in a somewhat artificial environment in order to produce more. So I'd like you to pause here for a second, and I'd like you to complete the next page using your book. So you're going to go through some of these different methods of fishing, and I'd like you to try to link them up a little bit with what you see in the picture so that you know what they look like. And you're going to look at some pros and cons. And then I'd like you to come back after that, and let's continue with aquaculture. So aquaculture is one of the ways that we can help to produce more fish using the resources that we have and feed enough people. And basically it's just fish farming, and there's lots of different ways that you can operate in terms of aquaculture. So in many cases, this may be done in sort of an open pen that's in either an offshore area or maybe a bay like the Chesapeake Bay. And there's a lot of kind of negative aspects to this, and you have these on the last couple of pages in your fact cards. So you can see, if you take a look there, that a lot of other things may be released into the surrounding water, like diseases, some of those excess nutrients which can cause eutrophication, things like chemicals such as antibiotics that are given to the fish to keep them healthy. So all of that can come into play. Now there are other methods that you'll see back there, such as ponds and raceways and recirculating systems, where they're kept a little bit more isolated, and in some cases that can be healthier, but in some cases that actually leads to even higher levels of disease for the same reason that stockyards do with livestock. One of the problems that we have with raising enough fish and shellfish is, again, the government is subsidizing it. So we spend way more money on fishing than we can actually make back from what we catch. And without subsidies, a lot of our fishing fleets would go out of business. And this would really cause a ripple effect, because when those watermen went out of business, that would mean that they needed to find jobs elsewhere, or they were unemployed and then collecting welfare, or somehow struggling to survive in other ways. So you really can't think, it's not as simple as let's just take away all the subsidies. We have to find a solution that can allow everybody to keep their jobs, or at least find an alternate source of income, while still sustainably harvesting these food resources. So I want you to just take a minute now and go back to that last couple pages in your packet, read through those different types of aquaculture that we can have, and then just answer those last couple questions about that. And then we'll go forward from here by talking about some of the possible solutions that we might have to this problem of not enough food, and also how we can use both pesticides and other methods to increase our food production. All right, I will see you next class. Bye-bye.